Okay, well, everyone is in for a big treat today because today we are going to get nitty gritty on seeds. Yes, you heard it, seeds. Welcome, Rick, to the Flower Podcast.
Happy to be here, Scott. Thank you.
Well, I'm really thankful. One of the things that came out, and you may or may not know this, but from the interview that I did earlier this season with the Arnoskis, was we got talking after the interview about the whole seed selection and just quality of seeds and things like that. And so that's what sort of spawned like, oh, this would be a great topic just to kind of get in to let everyone know in the flower world what's involved with that. And so, okay, so I know that I've read about you and I've done a little bit of research and you are a wealth of information on this topic. But I always have to ask, how did you get into the what you do now? Maybe tell us about your company a little bit, or we can get into that later. But how did you start in the world of hybridizing and flowers and all of that?
It actually started back when I was teaching high school. I learned about this organization called the Seed Savers Exchange.
Yes.
This would have been back in 1977. And I called them up and said, hey, what's going on? And learned that the founder, Kent Whaley, Kent and his members in the Seed Savers Exchange were having trouble keeping strains true to type. If you think about heirloom vegetables, any crop for that matter, when you save a seed, you want to make sure that it's going to give you what you think you're going to get. And when seeds cross-pollinate, you lose all of that. So I volunteered to work with Kent and help coach his people on how best to save heirloom vegetables so that they were true to type. And that sent me to graduate school, and I trained as a tomato breeder
Wow.
and continued to work with Kent early on. Some of the pictures in the Seed Savers Exchange annuals had my hands in them because I was teaching people how to make pollinations. I haven't been really associated with those guys for a long time, even though I'm still a member. Ways parted, everything, life
Yeah.
goes on. They went down one path, I went down another. But that's really where it started. I wanted to help somebody do it right, and I figured out how to do that.
Wow. So obviously that took you down this path of hybridizing, which it's such a complicated thing and people don't realize that. What kind of stuff do you work with now, or tell us a little bit more about maybe your company and how you how you do what you do?
So I have this little company, independent plant breeder called GardenGenetics. We are about 7 miles from the campus of Penn State.
Okay.
So I have access to some research facilities there that make some things easier. But we're independent. We do our own thing. We breed our own crops. I work with flowers. I work with perennials. I work with shrubs. I work with vegetables. I do a lot of work with culinary herbs.
Hmm.
Um, if you think about life in general, as a plant breeder, I look for places where nobody is working. I look for crops where nobody's improved them in 20 or 30 or 100 years. And I look at those for, is there an opportunity here? Can I do something with, bronze fennel to make it better? Can I do something with Rudbeckia herta to make it better? A lot of my projects have taste or flavor or fragrance potential. A lot of my projects have disease resistance potential because I see making the plant more robust is a better way for the environment than selling somebody more pesticides. I have no trouble with pesticides. I worked that industry for a long time, know it very well. But if you can make the plant better, you can actually reduce pesticide usage to a large degree. It works really well hand in hand.
I
So a
love
lot of
that
the things
idea.
I do drive that.
Yeah, I really love that idea. Better plants, less chemicals. That's a good thing. So I we have this great opportunity as you being a guest to kind of get into just some basic sort of genetics, because I feel like a lot of times you've already touched on this issue where people try to save their own seed and they get surprises because things like, well, why didn't it come true and all this kind of stuff. Do you kind of mind and this is a gigantic topic and I know it is. So we just kind of have to shrink it down and just to kind of give people an idea that may not have had a genetics course in college or even in high school, just kind of how this whole thing works because it's so complicated. And it makes me appreciate people like you and the work you do even more. So I don't know, maybe try to unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, it is a huge topic. Just,
Well,
just
there's whole
huge.
college courses on this. So yeah. So let's do it in 5 minutes. Okay.
Yep. Let me start by saying that Gregor Mendel was really lucky in choosing to work with peas. Actually, it's rather amazing that he successfully made crosses with peas because crossing peas is not easy. And there are people who look at Mendel's work and say, he couldn't possibly have done that. The numbers are too good. And how did he figure out how to cross peas? But anyway, it's not easy. The single textbook version of dominant versus recessive genes, for instance, comes, let's just talk about, I have a red flower plant. I have a white flowered plant. I cross them. What do I get? Well, you have to sow the seed. So you don't just make the cross and then you've got to go through a whole process of making the seed, having the seed germinate, and all of that fun stuff. So, if you cross a red flowered plant with a white flowered plant and the babies are all red, classically, that means that red is dominant over white. If you cross a red by a white and all the babies are white, white is dominant. Both of those happen, by the way. If you cross a red by a white, you get a pink. A geneticist is going to say that's incomplete dominance. Red is not dominant over white. They are equal. Therefore, they are either co-dominant or incompletely dominant. And those words are basically the same. So let's just assume that we're going to do this. Well, it's never that easy. You think about walking into a field of flowers. Are they all the same shade of red? Are they all the same shade of white? When you cross red by white, are they all the same shade of pink? Not usually. Let's back up. How do I know that my red flowered plant is going to give me red flowered seedlings? You have to test it. How do I know that my white flowered plant is going to give me 100% white flowered seedlings? You have to test it. So when you start figuring this stuff out, you need to make sure that, first of all, each parent line is true breeding. Red always gives red, white always gives white, and then you can start mixing them up and seeing what happens. So they have to be true breeding. True breeding is important. The second thing you have to think about is that how does the plant actually make seed? Some plants are wind pollinated. Some plants are insect pollinated. Some plants are really promiscuous. They'll accept pollen from anybody and make seed. Most of the time, that doesn't happen. And if you start trying to make crosses in a very methodical and planned way, you need to know how the plant works. You need to know whether it's going to accept pollen from its neighbor or not. And sometimes you need it to, and you have to figure out how to trick the plant to accept pollen when in nature it might not do that. All possibilities exist in the natural world. Biology is really fun because simple rules never are 100%, ever. So,
and one thing I want to interject in here is all of this takes time. It takes years. I mean, this isn't like a 1 year process. This is like who knows how many years. So it depends on the flower, I guess.
If you're breeding for a vegetatively propagated thing, you can get lucky and get it to the market in 3 to 5 years. If you're breeding for seed, you're looking at 8 to 12.
Wow.
We figure that running GardenGenetics, every project And each project might generate any number of new varieties eventually. But just turning the crank on every project costs between $25,000 and $30,000 a year. A year
Per project.
per project.
Oh my gosh.
And
I didn't see that coming.
if it takes 10 years to develop, it's 10 times 25. So how do I recover a $250,000 investment in a single project? This is what the business side of what I do is. Every crank of the turn, every turn of the crank takes time. Time is money. It's really that simple.
And I'd like to think that it's easier than picking a horse at a race, if you're betting, because you put that money down and you've got to wait. I mean, I've never bet on a horse. I haven't even been to a horse track. So why am I using this analogy? I don't know. But you put the money down and you're waiting to see who wins, hoping it's a winner, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you got to get pretty good pretty quickly, or you end up wasting a ton of time and money, I would guess. So
correct, you do.
I know I've seen some photographs of some of the things you've bred or you've been involved in, and I think you're pretty good at picking winners, which I'm like pretty excited about. Anyways, I'm interrupting, so go ahead.
No. What you don't see are the thousands of things we throw away.
Good point.
And what you don't know is that if we put 1,000 experimental varieties into the hands of our licensees, we might get 10 to market. So the funnel is pretty narrow.
Wow.
So not only is there a narrow funnel as a breeder, going from all the variation possible down to the 100 plants we might put into somebody's trials, when they look at those 100, they're comparing them to everybody else's variety, and 100 could become 1 or 0.
Wow. Ouch.
Yeah, it is not simple to get new varieties into the market.
Wow.
But on the independent side, everybody thinks it's easy. I find something cool in the field, I'm just going to take it and put a name on it and sell it to somebody.
Right. Sometimes
you get lucky. Sometimes it works. To do it methodically is a challenge. It really is.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Back to our red and white flower cross. Right? We have a pink. The pink's the first generation. If you're lucky, every flower in that first generation is pink and is the same shade of pink. We're going to keep this simple.
And luck will be on our side, so go ahead.
And then you take that pink flower and you self-pollinate it, if it will self-pollinate. And then you sow the seeds and you look at the second generation. In the classic model, you see 3 different classes of flowers in that second generation. You see half the plants are going to throw flowers that are the color of their parents, a quarter red, a quarter white, and half the plants are going to look like the first generation, all pink. That is the simplest model. It sometimes works, not often. You get various shades of red. You get a lot of whites that blush, a little bit of pink. They show a little bit of color. And you get all sorts of shades of pink. What I want to warn you is that when you look at these things in any kind of detail, everybody wants to explain them in the simplest way possible. Right. And they draw these pretty little cartoons in the textbooks that have red and white, pink. Everything's perfect. And it doesn't happen that way.
Yeah.
Life is not a cartoon. Biology is not a cartoon. Cartoons help us understand the complicated stuff, but they're not real. Yeah. They're just not real.
And, it's interesting because I know I've talked to different people who work with roses over the years and some other varieties of flowers. And it's almost like the more hybridized something is, the more complicated this process becomes because you've got just more, I don't know, more more cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. And yeah.
When you start crossing different species,
Oh wow, yeah.
all the rules go out the window because you have different sets of chromosomes, and normally those sets match up and then split, and everything works relatively smoothly. You cross two species, the chromosomes don't match up anymore. And if they split, you get all sorts of weird things happen on the other side. And that weirdity is where the cool variety comes from. You get variation that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But inside the plant cell, those chromosomes are really messed up. And they trade parts and they throw parts away, and you never know what's going to happen. And that's fun, but it's not predictable.
Wow. Okay, so that's helpful, I think, because I know a lot of times we can go down a lot of paths here, I know. Um, like right now, I'm kind of curious, what are you guys working on? Well, let me ask this question. Let me back up. Like, so you create these plants through hybridization, and then how do they get out into the market? Because you don't sell direct to anybody, right?
No. Um, GardenGenetics, my business, is an intellectual property company. That means we breed it, we create it, we develop it, and those are all slightly variations on the same thing. Mm-hmm. And then we protect it. In the US, we get a patent on it. Outside of the US, there's another process, but it's kind of like patenting. And then we license those protected varieties to big companies. The Ball Organization, Doom and Orange, Proven Winners. Those guys are my customers, they're my clients. We typically refer to them as licensees because we are licensing our patented variety, our protected variety, to a bigger organization. Mm-hmm. And at that point, they run with it. They figure out how to produce it in quantity, they market it, they sell it, and then whether it's once a quarter or once a year, I get a report on everything they sell, and I turn that report into an invoice, and they pay me a licensing fee for every unit they sell. Now, you think of that, that's really cool. You go to Home Depot and buy a Proven Winners container, Rick is getting a piece of that. Is it a big piece? No. If you pay $20, $19.99 for a 2-gallon perennial, I probably get a quarter out of that amount. If you buy a $5 annual in a 4-inch pot, I might get 3 cents.
Wow. I'm surprised.
Licensing fees are generally quite modest. The goal is to have as many products in the market as you can so that there's a little piece coming from every product. Think about in a sports analogy. An independent plant breeder doesn't go for home runs. You're never going to get there. You go for singles, and you're happy if you get a double. So you just build up a whole portfolio of single base hits, and eventually that can build into a decent revenue stream. But it takes a lot of time, a lot of work, and a lot of upfront investment.
That's
typically
insane.
Annuals are 3 to 5 cents a piece. Perennials are 5 to 25 cents. Shrubs, 25 to $1. Things like roses might go higher. Fruit trees go higher. But the higher the licensing fee, and some people call a licensing fee a royalty.
Right.
There's a tax distinction there, at least according to some people. But the higher the licensing fee, the lower the volume, and vice versa. if you want to sell 1,000,000 units of something, you're not going to see much more than 5 cents or 10 cents per unit.
Mm.
But if you stack up enough of those, it's a decent revenue stream.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Especially when you see the amount that you have to invest into potential new crops and the time with that, like we talked about earlier. It sounds like it could be a lot of money, but then you have to constantly be investing in. I know some entrepreneurial people like to refer to it as the pipeline. You're creating additional revenue streams at some point. So it's really fascinating. So I'm curious, like right now, what are you working on at the moment? Or maybe even like how many different plants do you have out in the marketplace now? Like,
as of today, GardenGenetics has about 50 to 60 patents in place. There's another 30 to 50 on top of that are in process where the licensee has agreed to take it. They're ramping up production. The patent might not have issued yet because it's all a process. So let's say there's 100 to 150 things in market. I've probably got a pipeline of another 150 to 200 just waiting to go. Because every year you turn the crank. In every project, you look at it and say, that one has potential. The rest of those, throw them away.
That's so sad.
And I just don't harvest seed out in the field and grow it and hope. We're very methodical. We take a plant, we inbreed it, we cross and see what we get. We use that information and do the next cycle so that in my head house, where my office is, we have probably 50 boxes per year. So there might be 50 projects running. Every box might have somewhere between 10 and 200 seed packets representing individually distinct lines that we will then methodically cross. And we're a small business. I mean, right now, it's me, a couple of technicians. I've had as many as 20 or 30 people working with me at GardenGenetics, but we've cut back. I'm trying to relocate and move closer to my grandkids. So you've got to kind of put everything in a box once a year and hope that you sell the farm. But so we're running at a slower scale, but the pipeline is so full that if I never sowed another seed, I could probably run GardenGenetics for 5 years, 7 years.
Wow.
Just pulling stuff out of the pipeline.
Yeah, that makes me think of a question. Do you, like, for example, I don't know of a plant. I'm trying to think of one of the varieties now, but if there's something that is successful for you, how many years does it stay trending or viable, or do you get to still collect licenses, or is that one of those things that goes on forever, or do some things kind of taper off because new things pop up and there's only so much space in the zone?
I ask that question all the time. I ask it of myself. I ask it of my licensees. I ask it all the time. The patent life of a protected variety in the US is 20 years.
Okay.
So I have 20 years. If I brand it myself and put a trademark on it, and I'm just beginning to do that with certain products, the life is indefinite as long as you keep the trademark active. In the perennial community, the geranium variety Roseanne had been patented and trademarked. The patent expired. The trademark is still valid. So the inventors of Roseanne are now collecting a reduced licensing fee for the trademark value, even though they can no longer collect the full licensing fee based on the fact that it's protected.
Okay.
So you got 20 years usually. The real question is, how long is it truly viable in the market?
Right.
An annual, 3 to 5 to 7. A perennial, 5 to 10. A shrub, 10 to 20. And the really good things will last all the way through the patent life. Geranium Roseanne is a good example. It made it through its patent life. There's still a huge market demand for it. It's off patent. It's like a generic pharmaceutical.
Yeah.
When it goes generic, the price drops.
Yeah.
Well, the price in our world really doesn't drop because horticultural production is pretty darn cheap anyway. But the licensing fee had to drop.
Right.
So they
kept it, yeah, or whoever.
So, yeah, whoever. So it takes time. Yeah. Now, the real question is, think of the plant world, whether it's annuals or perennials or cut flowers, like a supermarket. How many slots on the supermarket shelf really exist? Yeah. How many slots are there for new products? Because everybody's going to want to buy white bread. So you bring out a brown bread or a pink bread or a red bread or a whole wheat bread or a tomato basil bread. How do you get it on the shelf? There's only so many slots a year. So I asked my licensees, how many, you introduced 100 new products last year. How many are you going to introduce next year? 100? 100? What happens to the old ones?
Yeah.
Some of them slide off to the side. Some of them continue in production. Every big organization goes through a process where they look at how many items they have and they try and trim off the ones that don't sell. If that came from you as an independent breeder, you don't like the fact that they're dropping that variety. But they will. It's inevitable. So again, it depends on the class, but figure you're going to look at 5 to 20 years max. If you release something to the market that is difficult for the licensee to produce, you might go fewer than 5 years.
Wow. Well, it's almost overwhelming to think of that dynamic. You put all this time and energy into something, and then you hear what the lifespan of it is. Hopefully, if the market responds positively or consumers respond positively, it's like it's all in their hands. So it's crazy. So I'm really curious what you're working on now. Most of our listeners are either florists or farmers, and so anything in particular that you think might be interesting to our community?
Keeping in mind that I'm pretty much of a geek, I do a lot of work with making flowers different. I like plants that are sterile because the flower life in the vase is longer. I like making flowers that are pollen free because think about what happens with sunflowers, for instance. Pollen-free sunflowers are huge. Everybody buys Easter lilies and has to go in there and pick out the anther.
I've done that a few times.
Yeah, we all have. So, but if you can breed them to be sterile, if you can breed them to be pollen-free, I think there's potential value there. And that's what I'm trying to do with Rudbeckia Herta, typical black-eyed Susans. It can be done. I worked with a breeder 5 years ago named Irene Palmer, who went back to North Carolina. Irene had figured out how to make sterile pollen-free Hertas. And I've now taken that work and began to apply it methodically to a number of different types of Hertas, because I see a cut flower market potential for those Rudbeckia Hertas, especially if they don't make pollen, and especially if they're fully sterile, because the plants will continue to grow and flower. When a plant makes seed, typically it stops flowering. So one of the breaks you have to find is, I want it to flower from June until October in the field. How do I do that? You got to stop it from making seed, first of all. And then it will continue to flower if you're lucky. And if you can make those flowers then not have any pollen so that they have a longer base life, you've got a good product.
Yeah.
But it's not easy.
Oh, no.
It takes probably 3 to 5 generations of breeding to make a final cross. that will give you that sterile, pollen-free black-eyed Susan. And as you're going down that path, you're selecting for green cones, brown cones, you're selecting for lemon yellow petals, dark gold petals, red, orange, with and without eyes. All those things happen as you're inbreeding, and those now become important. But really, the vision has to be, I want to make this pollen free. How do I do that? Oh, we got lucky and have more or less figured it out. And some days it looks like it's more, some days it looks like it's less. Again, it's a lot of geek work. There's a lot of lab time involved. But apply that to anything you touch. As a plant breeder, if I have a sterile plant, I now have control over its production.
Right.
Nobody can use it in breeding. Nobody can make seed on it. And as an ornamental breeder, because I want longer and longer and longer flowering, I tend to breed for things that aren't going to be propagated by seed. Now, I know your listeners have a lot of interest in field-produced cuts. Field-produced cuts are typically done from seed. That may not be the best solution for them as a grower, and it's certainly not the best solution for me as an independent breeder. I breed mostly for vegetative varieties in flowers.
Sure.
And I do seed breeding for other things, but not in flowers.
Right. Well, the one thing that I see is a huge benefit, and yes, it might not be a benefit to say, oh, well, I can just go plant the seed, and then I can have, sterile Rebeckias that, whatever. But the thing is, but by going your route, we may end up being able to extend the season of what we would normally only be able to cut for a handful of weeks, maybe more than likely 3 weeks, and then to extend that season on and to have cleaner, better flowers and to have longer shelf life. I mean, it seems like it is a trade-off, but it sounds like it's a good trade-off. It just takes more time. Sometimes it takes, with an annual, you can plant a seed and get a crop, or get a flower that first year to kind of know what you've got genetically. But with a lot of perennials, it may be, it's often not that first year. It could be the second year when you really get to see what's going on, which only adds more time. The thing that excites me is it's kind of like with echinaceas. We see so many colors now in echinaceas, but I'm really excited at the idea that with Rebeckias, we may be seeing more colors and all these new varieties coming out. I know this is never a quick process like we talked about. So when do you think, like, this project you're working on now, which I know is I say project, you're probably working on, as we've talked about, anywhere from 20 to 50 within this one project. Like, when can we start seeing some of these beauties, do you think? Next year, the year after, or?
The first trial of the first cut flower variety will be a long-stemmed, sterile, red flowered Herta.
Wow.
We're going to trial it next year on a small scale. And if it works, we'll continue down that path. But again, many years of breeding to a final cross to make a selection, and the ratio of success at that point is still going to be 100 to 1. You sow 100 seeds, you get one plant you might like. And it takes time. It's a numbers game. It's a real numbers game.
Yeah. Well, one thing I kind of wanted to discuss, because, like you mentioned seed savers earlier, and I know that traditionally in farming, a lot of times people have saved seed to carry over. And I think it's harder now to do that than ever. I mean, it's not hard to do, but it's like going to Vegas. You're not going to know what you're going to get, the next year. But just in basic techniques, I'm kind of curious, for people who are interested in trying to save their seed, could we just maybe talk about, like, what are some good, techniques, like how to do it, storage, things like that?
Let's start with real broad general strokes.
Yeah, we have to.
If you're saving your own seed, you need to be able to dry it and store it cold. Cold and dry is always good. On top of that, every species is a little bit different. If you're trying to sell it, all of a sudden now you have rules about plant sanitation, weed seeds, germination, all that. But if you're just growing it for your own use, just keep it dry and cold and you might get lucky. Usually dry and cold works. If you want to keep it true to type, then you have to get a little more detailed. You need to know, does it normally wind pollinate? If it wind pollinates, every color needs to be separated by about a quarter mile.
Wow, that far.
And sometimes farther. If it's insect pollinated, typical seed production guidelines are hundreds of feet apart, so that you might have a yellow on one side of your farm and your red might have to be on another part of your farm. In California, where open pollinated production used to occur, a lot of it was done around the town of Lompoc on the coast, where Vandenberg Air Force Base is. The reason it was done in Lompoc is that there's a mountain range, a coastal mountain range just inland from the sea. And there are these little pockets of fields up in the canyons that are totally isolated by the ridges. And those little pockets became very convenient places to produce a seed crop isolated from everything else. 50 years ago, if you were to drive up a little canyon road and come down into the valley, you might see 4 different colors of plants. They wouldn't be the same species. It might be a zinnia and a marigold and a sweet pea and an alyssum. But they isolated colors in these little canyon fields because they could. And that's why the seed industry ended up there. All that's being done in Mexico, in the Baja, or in Chile, or in Africa right now, because low labor costs. But isolating is really important, and how much isolation you need to do is entirely a function of the plant you're working with. Right now, I'm producing cilantro and dill as I'm trying to ramp up production. I have one cilantro variety on my farm. I have one dill variety on my farm. I'll harvest that seed, clean it, test it, and send it to a production company to actually commercialize it. But I couldn't even trial a second cilantro on my farm. The farm's too small. I've only got 20 acres. I couldn't produce a second crop of dill here because the farm's too small. So these are the things you have to think about. And if you're trying to produce a seed crop for a cut flower seed, for instance, are you doing a mix? Well, you might be able to produce a mixture once, but sooner or later, it's going to run to the most dominant colors, the strong colors. Because in flowers, the colors are usually dominant to white, just not always. But it's going to all end up being muddy pink in 5 years, just because that's the way the genetics work. So if you're trying to find true types and keep them true to true breeding, it takes a lot of space and it takes a lot of understanding about how the plant works. A farmer can't do that. I mean, it's just not going to work for very long.
Right. And it's interesting you say that, because I always, because of my education, I know the answer to this, but it makes me think of the question for others. When you're going through catalogs, you see F1s, for example. What does that mean when you start seeing some of these distinctions by the seed?
The F comes from the word filial, Filial, and that means filial brother. It refers to the generation after you make the cross. If I cross 2 parents, the first generation is referred to as the first filial generation, which means the F1. If I take that F1 and self it, I generate the second filial generation, the F2. The F1 is generally very uniform. The F2 is less uniform. And if you let it just go wild at the F2, what you get is just a total random mixture coming out after that.
Right. So I know that's one thing that if people are buying seed, if they see that F1, the odds aren't very good that if they save those seed, they're going to get the same thing again, because it's not that place in the genetic tree anymore. So
it doesn't mean you won't generate a crop,
right?
But it does mean you're going to get a mediocre crop, and it's not going to look like what you started with.
Sure. So, one thing that I have noticed over the past few years is, and we've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I've seen more and more flower growers trying to sell their seed. And on some of them, I see something that is like a species lily, for example, which I feel like if it's a species, that's probably going to come fairly true. But in general, what are some what are some things that people should look for? Because I didn't realize till we were emailing back and forth how regulated seed production, or seed sales, I should say, really is. And so what are some things that people should look for when they're buying seeds so they can have some peace of mind? I know. I keep asking you these gigantic questions, and you're doing such a great job condensing this. So I appreciate you.
Okay. If I were buying seed, and I buy seed from a lot of people, and I buy seed every year. But if I'm buying seed from a non-commercial source, I'm going to want to know how they produced it. I would like to know if it's produced in isolation, so there's no risk of cross-pollination between colors or types or what the desired targets. I'm going to want to know how uniform it is. I'm going to want to know how they know it's uniform. Do they do a grow out? Do they test it? If I'm selling you seed this winter 2021, 22, and you produced it in 2021, you're going to have a chance to test it. You probably don't know its germination. You certainly don't know how true to type it is, and you're selling it to me. That's a bad sign. In some crops, you have to sanitize the seed. Otherwise, you carry a pathogen from generation to generation. And within the seed industry, people generally know what those rules are. You can imagine if I sell you a lot of seed and every seedling is infected, that's a problem. You're going to lose the next generation. But if I sell you a lot of seed and every seedling is infected, and you now infect your entire county,
right,
that's a huge problem. And when you get into the nitty-gritty details, if there's high economic value, you'll say your flower crop is related to cotton or tobacco or corn or soybeans or rice or cabbages or tomatoes, and you sell an infected flower seed crop that wipes out half of the county's tobacco crop, if you're in North Carolina, that's a big problem. Or imagine if it wipes out the whole Southeast field corn production. That's a huge problem. You, as the seed seller, probably have some liability, some responsibility at an ethical level, certainly, but certainly at a financial level, you probably also have a financial risk of, if you contaminate your whole county or your whole state or your whole region, this is not a good thing.
No.
And that's the risk you're taking by not knowing what you're doing. So did you sanitize the seed, and how, why, and when? If you're producing the seed for sale, do you know how to isolate it? Do you know how to clean it? Do you know how to grade it? The seed germination standards that the USDA puts out are minimum standards, and minimum standards generally going into seed packets, because you don't want to go to the Home Depot and pull a packet off the shelf and get nothing. So
Right.
there are standards. The professional trade has much higher standards than the typical seed packet trade. The professional trade wants to have they want the germination to be as high as possible and as close to 100% as possible. How do you get how do you get seed where every seed germinates in 3 days instead of 10 days, and every seed germinates instead of having 90% of them germinate? For professional grade seed, 90% is not good enough anymore.
Really?
95% is usually the cutoff. And people argue that between 95 and 100%, there are seed companies who will say, we can do 97. We guarantee it. Think about how to do that. Seed has to be cleaned, sized, graded, germ tested. It is a really involved science to make sure that every seed is good. There are people with the high value crops that literally scan every seed going into a packet at a professional level so that every seed germinates. You don't get that just going out to the field and cutting the tops off an acre of seed. It just doesn't work. You have to know what you're doing. So it's really sophisticated. I buy a lot of seed online. I mean, I look for things that people collect in their backyards. If I buy online seed, I can look at it and tell you whether it was produced commercially and just repackaged. A lot of people online do that. They buy an ounce of seed from Park Seed or Gardens Alive or somebody, and they repackage it under their own name and sell it online by selling 10 seeds at a time or 20 seeds at a time. I buy some of that.
Is that okay to do?
Oh yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if there are like rules that regulate that, because I've seen a lot of people do that, and I just curious.
Is it okay to do? Is it okay to go faster than 70 miles an hour on the turnpike?
Okay, now you're getting personal. Okay, so
nobody's going to go after the little guys because it's a waste of time.
Sure.
So it might be illegal, but it's not. No one's going to catch you. No one's going to enforce it. But it doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist. I can look at what comes in and know if you're repackaging or not. At least half, probably 3/4 of the seed that I buy that comes in is not going to germinate very well. It's not going to be true to type. It's often I get no seed at all. I get a seed packet full of chaff because the seller doesn't know the difference between chaff and seed. And in some crops, it's difficult to tell the difference.
And you can tell that just by looking at the seed a lot of times.
Yeah.
Because it's just your experience. That's what you do.
That's what I do. I know what it's supposed to look like.
Right.
And if you think about it, if we go and make a hand cross and harvest that seed pod, I need to know how to tell my technicians, this is a good seed and that's a piece of chaff.
Right.
And we do all of the above. We have machines that help us sort it. A lot of our small scale work, we sit with a piece of paper and pick one seed at a time because it's faster than trying to figure out how to do it. I have screens of different sizes. I have machines that blow air and throw the chaff away. But in the end, someone's got to look at it and say, this is a good one, and that's a bad one. It takes experience.
Yeah.
It just takes time to do it.
Yeah. Crazy. Well, I'm curious for people who want to learn more about some of this. Is there a book you'd recommend or a course you'd recommend or something?
There's nothing for the flower seed industry per se.
Okay.
But if you go to the Seed Savers Exchange,
okay,
and I would recommend that you do, there's a book called Seed to Seed written by a woman named Suzanne Ashworth. And her book talks about saving vegetable seeds, but at a very basic level, the practices are the same between vegetables and flowers. You do have to figure out, okay, She's talking about saving tomato seed. Is my plant like a tomato? She's talking about saving sweet corn seed. Is my flower going to be more like a sweet corn than a tomato? There's some botany that you're going to get into to figure it out. But the basic practices, go to the vegetable community. The heirloom people have done a good job. And I highly recommend the Seed Savers Exchange as a source of information for that kind of stuff.
That's amazing. You know, out of all the crops that out of all the plants or flowers that you've developed over the years, I'm curious, what has been the most challenging variety to work with?
Petunias.
Petunias.
And the reason is that it's so difficult to find a way into the market because there are so many people working with it that getting it placed is the problem. Breeding it is not the problem. The genetics, the plant is very workable. Placing a petunia or a verbena or a calibrachoa or any of the vegetative annual class is very difficult because all the likely buyers are doing it themselves. And competing as an independent breeder, competing with my licensees for that vegetative annual market is almost impossible. I've gotten lucky a couple of times. It's been very difficult because it's just too crowded.
Yeah.
How do you stand out? How do you make your product better than what they're breeding internally?
Now, are they introduced, and I don't really know what I'm talking about here, so I know you do. And they introduced like some GMO situations, you know, to kind of get in the gene pool to introduce new colors in petunias. Have I seen that? It seems like I'm like looking at some of these things and I'm like, how is that even possible?
4 years ago, the USDA yanked an orange petunia from the market that everybody in the breeding community had been using for about a decade. It was an accidental release of a GMO in a field in North Holland. And everybody's going to argue how it got loose. The reality is petunia seed doesn't die in the cold. I have petunias as weeds in all the fields where we have petunia seedlings. So somehow this GMO orange petunia got loose and everybody started working with it. And it ended up, there was an All-America selections winner that had this gene in it. Everybody had it in their breeding program. The gene for that orange color actually came from field or from flint corn, ornamental corn.
Really?
And the gene was put into the petunia probably in 1987, 88. And it kind of circulated around the breeding community for that long. And
it's a long time ago, though. You don't think of hearing about those things back then. So that's interesting.
The orange color, what the flower people call brick red color, doesn't exist in petunias. Biochemically, the enzyme does not exist in petunias by nature. So to get that orange red color, somebody had to take the gene from corn, ZMAs, and move it transgenically into petunia and then recover it, and it worked. It got on the cover of the most prestigious scientific journal. I actually know the woman who was one of the people who was on that team who did it. It was a marvelous piece of research, but it got loose. And the USDA said, stop. Nobody's allowed to sell this in the US until last year. And they changed their mind. So that same orange GMO gene is now being reintroduced into the US market. And you'll see orange petunias again. And the logic is nobody eats petunias, so it's okay.
Interesting. Now, I don't expect you to have seen this, but I want to throw it out there just in case. I want to say last year might have been the first year I've seen this, but it could have been the year before. But I'm going to say last year. There was a petunia series, and a lot of people are referring to them as Italian petunias, and they are a lot of them are doubles, not all of them, but a lot of them are
Mhm.
doubles, and they're being grown because they get a stem length on them, not super tall, not like a traditional cut flower, but long enough that some people have. I think there's a company or two that brought the plugs in this year, and a lot of the smaller scale flower farmers have been growing them because they sell direct to florists, and it's a good color, it's a good shape. I don't Have you heard of what I'm talking about at all? I'm just curious.
The doubles that you're talking about are typically picotees, or they have stripes, and every petal is highly frilled. Same
Yes,
product.
think so. Yes.
I'm going to complicate things. Those are typically tetraploid petunias.
Okay.
Um, there's a name for them.
Oh, it's just interesting to get some stem length on. They're still, it's so funny because people, I hear mixed reviews on it because sometimes people don't like the fact that they're sticky, like a petunia stem naturally
Oh
is.
yeah, it's going to be.
But it's going to be. But I just thought that was interesting. And I don't know. I just think it's the world of cut flowers is always evolving, and to see a flower that's a traditional bedding plant all of a sudden get introduced into our mix is kind of fun in a way. But I don't know. I just was curious if you knew anything about it. I also was kind of curious. Um, what is there something out in the market right now that's one of, I know you said we don't call them home runs, but something that has been tremendously successful that we've seen out there perhaps, or some things we can go look for?
You can start to see things from GardenGenetics coming to the market in a grower direct fashion
Oh, okay.
through an alliance I'm part of called Garden Choice.
Okay.
Garden Choice is an alliance between GardenGenetics, doing the creation and breeding, with Pioneer Gardens up in Massachusetts, who is a perennial nursery doing liner and bare root work. Co-Clover is involved. Co-Clover runs an organization called Botanical Trading, which is a grower direct sales function. Co is also connected to your website through your, Association of Specialty Cut Flower Growers.
Mm-hmm.
So Co is involved in that, and with the Alaska Peony people. And the fourth corner of that alliance is Eason Horticulture. Jim Eason and Co, Clover and Arjen Vriend and I have this four-cornered alliance where Eason is a sales broker. They've got 40 salespeople doing plants and hard goods.
Wow.
So I've got access to a perennial nursery that I don't have to own. I've got access to a sales specialist going grower direct that I don't have to pay. I've got access to 40 salespeople in the field who are not my employees, but they all work together. Now, I have licensees besides Garden Choice. Garden Choice just is a licensee for specific products. But I have other licensees that I support and breed for and have to keep everybody happy. Likewise, Pioneer sells products from a lot of people. They produce products for a lot of other breeders, not just GardenGenetics. And that's fine. Co-Clover represents a number of breeders around the world, not just GardenGenetics. Eason Horticulture represents breeders from around the world, not just GardenGenetics. So although we're tied together, although we're allied, each corner is independent. No, I don't share my financials with them. They don't share their financials with me.
Well, sure.
They don't need to do that, but we work together. And I'm releasing certain varieties through there that I think have real direct impact. The first of our Rebecca Hertas is a variety called Mini Beckia Flame. Mini Beckia Flame is about half the size of a typical garden Herta, maybe 60%. But its real advantage is that it's got really good basal branching, so that we could produce it from cuttings, we can produce it from tissue culture. It is sterile. It blooms all season long. It blooms early, and it makes a beautiful container with one input per 8-inch, 3 inputs per 12-inch. Can you make cut flowers out of it? Yes, but you're going to have to let it grow in a certain way. If you're putting it in a pot, 1 gallon, 2 gallon, it's great. If you want to produce it as a cut, I'll probably direct you to a different variety.
Sure.
But Mini Beckia Flame is the first of a series of Rebecca Hertas that are almost perfect for what we're trying to develop in the container market.
Mm-hmm. And I also noticed on your website there were several dahlia. You have a trademark name for that? I'm trying to think what it is.
Delightful.
Yes, Yes, that was really clever. Pretty varieties, but again, I can tell they're compact, more container-oriented type.
They're definitely
plants.
a container-oriented type. We have those in production in the Netherlands as tubers right now to see if that's going to be a viable way to do it. The Delightfuls are in a tweener stage. They're a little too big for the really small containers that people want to sell at the big box stores.
Sure.
And they're a little too small for the big tuber markets where people want to have great big dahlia cut flowers.
Right.
So selling tweeners is always hard. And we've struggled with the Delightfuls because of that.
How tall do those get?
Oh, 24
in the ground.
24 inches in ground.
Well,
Just
it's
a
funny.
little too. They're well branched, and therefore, if you're going to try and do cuts, you're going to have to dispud them and do all the handwork that really isn't going to be generally an appropriate thing. It's just too much labor.
Right. Well, I do know this. It's been interesting to watch the evolution of dahlias in the cut flower world, because everybody wants the big, gigantic ones, but then those come with their own share of headaches.
Of course.
With shipping, with rain, with bugs, with everything else. And sometimes they're just so big, they're hard to work with. That's why when I saw them, I really liked the colors that they came in. And I was just curious. So you just never know.
Everything is a compromise when you're making a selection. And you have to think from the very beginning what your target is. Where is it going to go? Who's going to grow it? Who's going to sell it? Who's going to buy it? And it's real easy to make something this big. It's really hard to make something that's this big that is still vigorous enough to produce a lot of cuttings and then grow quickly enough in the market. I'm looking at coleus right now.
I love
because
coleus.
Some of my licensees have picked up some coleus from it. And I'm getting, would like them to be a little more compact. Well, when you go from a regular landscape coleus to a compact coleus, cutting in the middle and getting that tweener size that is both vigorous enough to be production compatible, but smaller than everything else, there is no in-between point. It's really hard to get the plant that's in the middle and does everything everybody wants. I can give you a little one. I can give you a big one. Getting the tweener is a challenge.
No,
it doesn't matter what it is. Getting that tweener and having it be perfect is a real challenge.
Yeah, it's funny how people just think it's a manufacturing problem almost. Where kind of like the Wizard of Oz, where you can just dye your eyes to match your gown. That situation. It's kind of like, right. These aren't cookie cutters. These aren't done with mold. It's you have the limitations of the species, unfortunately, to work with. So,
Correct.
well, I have one last question I want to ask.
Okay.
I think you've answered everything so wonderfully. If um, for people that are starting out that are either growing flowers, and a lot of I'm seeing some exciting things happen with some of our flower farmers where they're trying to extend their sales season
Mm.
by growing plants like a potted dahlia, like some pot crops to get early spring crops or fall crops to just kind of extend their season. Anyway, all that to say, uh, is there a piece of advice that you would give people out there as they look to the horizon about what's coming? Like what trends have you seen? What feedback are you hearing? The rumbling, so to speak, of the demand that you're working towards. I'm just curious what you're seeing on the horizon.
When the pandemic hit, everybody was afraid that no one was going to buy garden plants. You couldn't get to the garden centers, you couldn't get to the greenhouses, blah, blah, blah. And the market boomed because everybody was home and needed something to do. Then the second year, 2021, everybody was afraid, oh, is it going to continue to grow? I'm now hearing from the front end of the supply chain that they are not seeing a demand decreasing. They're seeing it to be stable and likely to continue to increase, but at a slower rate. And I'm going, are you serious? The demand can't possibly stay where it is. They're saying, no, at least for the next 2 years, we have contracts in place to produce seeds or plants or whatever. And we don't see the demand decreasing. It's going to be stable. People have been converted. Are they fooling themselves? Only time will tell. I hope they're not. It would be really great to have the generation of people who learned to garden in the last 24 months continue to want to garden when the world goes back to normal, if it goes back to normal at all.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that because I was really hoping that might be what you were going to say because I felt like so many changes have happened personally with people over the last 10 years that having this part of our industry revitalized and interest in it again. It was, I know, I was talking with Alan Armitage, Dr. Armitage, and we were talking about that at one point, and it's just the idea that there's like this generation now that really has this disconnect with it, and this has really helped to just revive that, all so to speak. And I'm glad because I feel like that's I would hate for that to get lost. I mean, I would hate for that passion and love for gardening and flowers to get lost and or to skip a generation. That would be tragic. So anyway, well, Rick, thank you so much for your time and just
Welcome,
everything.
Scott.
This has been a great crash course in genetics and breeding and what to look for. I hope that all of our listeners have found this incredibly helpful. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Good to talk to you, Scott. Thank you.